All right, well, it's 12:02, so I'm gonna get us all started. Hello, my name is Claire Petersen, and I'm honored and excited to be doing the introductions for our two fantastic speakers, Dr. Jayachandran and Dr. Reguant, as well as running the Q&A session after the presentation. Like most of you, I'm a Northwestern alumni, and I graduated in June with a double major in environmental engineering and economics, and now I'm extremely fortunate to be working with Dr. Reguant on a big range of climate change research and different economics, like energy economic studies. So I'd like to start off my introduction with Biden's announcement that came this morning. So if you missed it, to kick off Earth Day and to kick off the White House's two-day virtual climate summit, Biden pledged to cut US greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. This target is nearly double the figure that the Obama administration was going to go for, and it's also a really important stepping stone for our goals of net neutrality by 2050. This goal was very much celebrated by governments around the world who are excited that the US is kind of joining the picture, but the reactions were a little bit more of a mixed bag back at home. So there's plenty of people who are applauding his commitments, but at the same time, there are those who are worried about the economic damages. And then in addition, there are people like me who are just a little bit nervous about how exactly the US and the rest of the world are going to be meeting these really big but really important goals that they've been setting. So that's why I'm really excited for our presentations today. They're going to be highlighting economic studies that have to do with mitigation strategies in both developed and developing countries to kind of get a sense of how we might be moving forward and whether or not these different strategies are working. So both of our speakers, Dr. Jayachandran and Dr. Reguant, are professors at Northwestern and are highly respected in the field of environmental economics. Dr. Jayachandran and Dr. Reguant are both recipients of the National Science Foundation Early Career Development Award and the Sloan Researchship Fellowship. In addition, Dr. Jayachandran is a recipient of the Ecological Society of America's Sustainability Science Award, and Dr. Reguant is a recipient of the European Award for Researchers in Environmental Economics under the age of 40. Dr. Jayachandran, who will be giving the first presentation, received her BA in Electrical Engineering from MIT, her master's in Physics and Philosophy from Oxford, and a PhD in Economics from Harvard. Dr. Reguant received her undergraduate degree in Economics from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona and a PhD in Economics from MIT. So without further ado, if you have any questions throughout these presentations, you can send them using the Q&A feature at the bottom, and I'll be monitoring them. But for now, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jayachandran.
Terrific. Thank you, Claire, and thanks everyone for participating. The Happy Earth Day, and I've been at Northwestern, I guess, for 11 years, so I can't scan everybody, but maybe I've taught some of you, or some of you were alumni before my time, or are current students. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about mostly one project of mine that's, as Claire said, is related to mitigation, and specifically mitigation in developing countries. But I'm going to kind of frame that in a bigger picture of climate change and low-income countries. So I'm mostly a development economist, meaning I focus on economic issues in low-income countries. So I'm going to say a little bit about the effects of climate change in developing countries, and then talk broadly about the opportunity to reduce carbon emissions in developing countries, and then focus in on this specific study on reducing deforestation in Uganda. So on that first point about the effects of climate change in developing countries, so as I'm sure many of you know, one of the travesties of climate change is that the most vulnerable, poorest people in the world are expected to be hurt the hardest by climate change. So there are many projections of climate change and how it'll affect different parts of the world. Here's one of them, but all of them share this broad picture. So in this is a projection of a scenario with 2-degree warming, and what's color-coded is the expected change in GDP growth, economic growth in different parts of the world, where the red tones are losses in GDP or slower growth. And you could see the red regions are really in the global south, in Latin America and Africa and Asia. So countries partly because they're hotter to begin with, so a rise in temperatures will take them from hot to even hotter, but also just related to their ability to adapt to climate change, the nature of what the economy is centered around, like agriculture, for various reasons. The poorest of the poor will be hurt hardest. And so that's why when thinking about climate change, it's important to think beyond our borders and how people around the world will be affected. Here's a different aspect of climate change and thinking about different countries around the world, which is which countries have contributed to atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So these two bar charts are dividing the world into categories based on the country's GDP. So these are World Bank categories of lower income, low income, middle income, and higher income. And the first bar is the population. So the richest countries here make up 10% of the world's population. And the second bar is showing you that what share of current emissions are coming from each of those categories of countries. And the rich countries like the US that make up 10% of the world's population are contributing 36% of carbon emissions. Meanwhile, the poorest parts of the world, which are large countries, so make up half of the world's population, are only contributing 15%. So this is a case where the poor countries that are expected to be hardest hit are also not the ones who are currently creating the problem. And it's even more dramatic if we think about the historical emissions. So today's atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are partly a function of past emissions. And if we look historically, it's even more dramatic that today's rich countries are really the big contributors. So, if you put those two things together, poor countries bear little responsibility for the problem the globe is facing, the world is facing today in terms of climate change. But beyond that, when we think about the burden of who should be paying to mitigate climate change, to reduce emissions, poor countries would feel the greatest hardship from paying to solve the crisis. So there might be some win-wins where we have some ways to mitigate that also create jobs, but I think ultimately there is going to be a trade-off, it's going to be a cost, whether that's in the US of spending a little bit less on something else or having slightly lower GDP growth, but that's going to be more burdensome in poor countries because, rather than maybe funding high-speed rail, it's about funding basic roads or paying for primary school for kids instead of making college more affordable. And so in that sense, kind of an extra dollar is just more meaningful to the global poor. So I think, I put those together and think that there's a strong sort of analytical case, or at least certainly a moral case, that rich countries should shoulder most of the burden of paying to mitigate climate change. And I think that's the jumping off point, or this is the jumping off point for what I want to talk about is one of the nice features of climate change, or a silver lining, is that we can really decouple who's paying for mitigating climate change and where that mitigation takes place. Those two things don't need to coincide. And so I want to kind of talk just broadly about this idea of opportunities to reduce carbon emissions in developing countries. And so we talk a lot about things being a global problems. The pandemic we're in is clearly reminding us we're in an interconnected world, and a lot of environmental problems spill over borders. But climate change is relatively unique in being in the sense that it's coming through an atmospheric level of greenhouse gases, and so the effect in the US of reducing a ton of emissions in Kenya or India or the US is the same for us, regardless of where that happened. Particulate matter, the pollution we breathe in, that might flow from China to the US or the US to China, but we're still going to be benefiting much more if we reduce those particulate matter right here in our borders. And so, that's a cost and a benefit, but it's a benefit, this global nature, when we think about where we could look to find ways to solve the problem. So if the Biden administration in the US wants to cut emissions, one thing to say is we want to cut emissions within the US borders. Another way to think about it is we want to have some offsets where part of we can meet that target by funding projects in Uganda or India or Mexico that reduce carbon emissions. And the reason we would do that is because our budget can go further. Many of the lowest cost opportunities to reduce emissions are in poor countries. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is there's just some low-hanging fruit because poorer countries are not necessarily on the same technological frontier that we're at. I think a classic example is that most landfills in the US have technology to reduce emission of methane and sort of have capture the gases that are emitted, whereas that technology is not in place in a landfill in, say, Honduras. And so that technology exists, but hasn't been paid for. You could pay for that, and that might be a cheap way to reduce emissions. Another reason, I think that's more subtle and kind of, you need to think through and the ethics of it, et cetera, and it's much more tied to what I'm going to talk about, is that there's a lower opportunity cost of the behavior change needed to mitigate when people are poorer. So think about commuting. If someone had to spend an extra hour a day taking public transportation instead of driving, they might be able to work an hour less per day. And so if they were making $50 an hour, that's going to cost them $50. If they were in a poorer country and making $1 an hour, or now I've forgotten if I said days or hours, but if they're making $50 an hour and you lose an hour, you're going to lose $50. If they're making $1 an hour, they'll lose $1. If we are thinking from a global budget, we can compensate that person for $1 more easily than the $50. And so that isn't to say that that dollar isn't more important to the poor person than the $50 is to the rich person. If we had to kind of make a choice between who do we deprive, I might say we should deprive the rich person of $50. But if we are aiming to compensate people and so that they're better off, we give them $1.10 so that they're better off, we can stretch our budget much further by taking advantage of those opportunities in poor countries. And so the goal here is to have a win-win, where we could think about a global marketplace for mitigation, where it's a win-win because a lot of those investments might have some local benefits too, like reducing particulate matter locally, but also this point I just made that you want to compensate the poor so that they're certainly not worse off and ideally can be better off financially, economically, in addition to having contributed to reducing emissions. Okay, so now let me dive into this example of one way to reduce emissions in developing countries, which is to reduce deforestation. And this is a project of mine with others on paying landowners in Uganda not to cut down the forest. So this is a project that took place in Western Uganda, this global Google Earth image. The yellow is where this took place, and this is based on a study that was published in Science in 2017. And it was a interdisciplinary project with people who in earth sciences who focus on analyzing satellite imagery. And I'll try to kind of draw out where there's economics, where the kind of economics training you might have had or are having comes into this. So first, just a reminder of what deforestation has to do with climate change. We all learned that with photosynthesis, trees and other plants are absorbing carbon dioxide. That means that a tree trunk is mostly carbon atoms. And so when a tree is cut down, that carbon is re-released into the atmosphere, combines with oxygen and becomes atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that might happen immediately if you burn it. It might happen over time if it's decaying. But cutting down trees is responsible for 10% of human-induced carbon emissions. The rest is basically fossil fuel emissions. So today, most of the deforestation is occurring in developing countries, partly because we've done a lot of the deforestation in the past in richer countries. Moreover, when kind of at a high level, when experts think about what are the cheap ways to reduce emissions, reducing deforestation in poor countries it often comes out close to the top. And it's for that reason I mentioned of people's opportunity costs. Like in Uganda, people are clearing forests to grow cassava for subsistence farming. And so they might clear an area and make $10 in income. That might be really important to feeding their kids, but in global terms, that's very little compared to the economic damage from that climate change or other ways other policies we have in our portfolio to reduce emissions by the same amount. Okay, so that still raises the question of how do you go about reducing deforestation in developing countries? And so this comes back to kind of the ethics of not wanting to make poor people worse off. If you ban deforestation, you would make people who are using that money to feed their kids or send their kids to school worse off. And beyond that, regulations are often not enforced as well in poor countries, so it's not clear that a ban would be effective. So a popular approach is to kind of use a carrot instead of a stick, or instead of banning something or fining people or punishing them, rewarding them if they do the environmentally good thing. And that kind of policy is called payments for ecosystem services, or PES. So this is, basically a financial incentive. You're giving people a financial incentive, just like performance pay in a firm would incentivize people to work harder, paying people to do a pro-environment behavior. So in this case, families own primary forest in Western Uganda, and they're paid if they don't cut down their forest. Okay, so it seems like maybe obvious that this is a good idea. Why did I go about trying to get evidence on whether it's really cost effective? The reason it might not actually be cost effective, and honestly, my guess going into this project was that it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be, is that yes, you're paying people, it's a voluntary program, you're not forcing people to enroll, and if you conserve your forest, you get money. And so the people for whom this program is going to be super attractive are people who weren't going to cut down their forest anyway. People aren't clearing all of their forest every year, or we wouldn't have any forest left. Someone might say, oh, my kids just left the house, we don't need to expand our agricultural land, or we're doing okay financially, we're not going to cut down trees. This program is a free money. I get paid if I conserve my forest, and I was going to do that anyway. And so you would be paying people, but you wouldn't actually get any more forests because they would have had conserved with or without your payment. And so the program is only effective, it's only decreasing carbon emissions if you're inducing some people who had been planning to deforest to actually start conserving. And so this is a problem of inframarginality in the jargon of economics that a lot of sort of financial incentives suffer, and it can make something pay out a lot of money without having a lot of benefit. And so you really need to kind of measure how much extra forest are you getting from such a program. And so that's what we aim to do. And specifically, kind of the innovation of this study was to do it to kind of evaluate a conservation program through a randomized control trial. So this is a technique that's been growing in popularity in the last 20 years in the social sciences, and kind of with a lot of the start of it in development economics. So the 2019 Nobel Prize went to 3 development economists for championing this technique to think about what policies best reduce poverty or best improve the environment. And so it's like a drug trial, what Pfizer or Moderna use, except you don't have a placebo. The control group knows they didn't have an intervention. So here we take villages where people own forest, and we randomly divide them into 2 groups, one that's offered the program and one that's not offered this PES program. And because we randomized, statistically, they should be very similar. And so then when later on we look at differences in the forest cover between these 2 groups, only one thing was systematically different between them. That was that the treatment group was offered this PES program, and the control group, it was just business as usual, where they weren't incentivized to conserve. And if we see more forest cover in the treatment group, we can attribute that to this program. So we know how much extra forest cover came about because of our program. So we did this here's the map on the right are the village boundaries for 121 villages in Western Uganda. And usually we randomize on a computer. This one, we did part of it in person just for buy-in for the local politician who kind of picked out which villages got the program and didn't. And then here's a little bit more detail on the study design. So it's 60 treatment villages where families, it was optional to participate, but they were offered money if they left their forest intact. And we compared that to 61 control group villages. And the main outcome we're going to look at is from satellite imagery. We're going to quantify how much tree cover there is in each of those sets of villages, and then see, where was there more tree cover in when the program was in place. We also did household surveys to measure people's economic well-being and what kind of behavior change they implemented if they conserved their forest. And then finally, the last economic piece of this is converting that environmental gains to dollars to think about, was that worthwhile? Was that worthwhile when we compare it to what the program's cost compared to the environmental benefits? So just a bit more detail, this was funded by the United Nations and to a grant to the Ugandan government. The Ugandan government had a local nonprofit called Chimp Trust, implement the program. And so the other piece of economics here is just, this is about kind of once you have incentives, how do you design the contract? So there's a lot of nuance in how best to design the contract. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think one of the advances here is I think our contract was a little bit more robust to loopholes than some of the national programs that, say, the Mexican government or the Costa Rican government have in place. So basically, people agreed not to cut trees on their land, and then Chim Trust had staff who would go and check in person if you had cut trees by looking for tree stumps, et cetera. And if you complied, you got $28 per hectare per year from Chim Trust in cash. So most people owned about 2 hectares of primary forest, so they were making, if they complied, $56 a year, or about $112 over the 2 years this program was running. So really, you want to run this program forever. Each year, someone is providing environmental benefits by keeping CO2 out of the atmosphere. And each year they should be paid, just like I might rent a house and pay each month. We're basically like renting the trees for their carbon sequestration, and we pay people a certain amount. Just for feasibility of this pilot, we did it for 2 years. And so the basic idea is that, if you get people to comply, that $112 is a lot less than what the environmental benefits might be, but how many of those people are actually changing their behavior, and how many would have conserved anyway. So part of the field work was household surveys, talking to people, but this is also, was a kind of fun way to combine remote sensing and satellite imagery. So we, this is old technology from 2012, 2013. Now you could do much more, but you could even then load up high resolution satellite imagery and work with landowners and map their land boundaries. The main analysis is going to be this high resolution satellite imagery of 2.4 meter pixels, where the left is a reverse color raw image, and you can see with your eyes each tree. There are 300 million pixels. There's no way we're going to categorize each by hand, so we use what we would now call machine learning, but a computerized algorithm to classify whether each pixel is a tree or not. And so you have, for this whole region in Western Uganda, pixel by pixel, 2.4 meters, whether it's a tree or not. You can overlay those polygons I showed you earlier of village boundaries, and then how much area in each village had tree cover. And you could see before the program, after the program, in the treatment villages and the control villages, and test for how much extra tree cover, if any, is existing in the treatment villages after the fact. And this is the main result. So this is as a percent change, before to after. What was the change in tree cover? And there was a 9.1% drop over this 2 years in the control villages. So if you do nothing, you lost 9.1% of your forest over 2 years. You could see how very quickly there's going to be no forest left in Western Uganda. In the treatment villages, there was still tree loss. Not everybody chose to participate in the program. Some signed up and didn't comply, but you made a big dent in the problem. The rate of deforestation or tree cover loss, where the difference is sometimes it's selective cutting of a few trees here and there, it more than halved. So you solved half of the problem through this program. So a lot of the people who you were paying must have changed their behavior, or you wouldn't have seen this difference. And so this is equivalent to, in each village, there were 5.5 extra hectares of trees because of this program. Okay, so the last piece of this is the cost benefit analysis. So through this satellite imagery and overlaying these polygons, I know how many hectares of trees there are in each village, but ultimately we want to think about how many tons of CO2 is that, and what's the social value of that to compare it to the program costs. So the first piece of that is how many metric tons of CO2 were delayed. So I'm using the word delayed because this isn't permanently averting it, because it was just a 2-year program, but it's still valuable to delay something bad into the future. So we that's just like there's a time value of money here, there's a time value of kind of any problem. So to convert hectares to metric tons, we use some data from Global Forest Watch, which characterizes how carbon rich are forests around the world. And in Western Uganda, there are 154 tons of carbon per hectare. The second piece is figuring out what the social or economic value of that is. And so here we draw on the social cost of carbon. We use the US EPA's social cost of carbon, which to permanently avert a ton of CO2 is valued at this time at $39. And this is a Nobel Prize, I guess, the year before the one I mentioned, which is from integrated assessment models that model climate and the economy and estimate what's the marginal damage from a ton of CO2, or in this case, what's the benefit in terms of GDP, less loss of life, better health, et cetera, from having less CO2. And so when we then think about the delay, each ton we delayed was worth $1.11. So we can do the same, we can put our costs of the program in the same units, the payments to the forest owners, the administrative costs, and that's 46 cents per ton. So this benefit of the program was $1.11, the cost was 46 cents. That's a very conservative estimate. My realistic guess of what it is actually that the benefits are 10 times the program costs. That's because we had made some pessimistic assumptions that turned out to be too pessimistic. So the benefits of this program are much higher than the costs. And as importantly, if I did the same kind of exercise for a lot of programs we're pursuing in the US, like subsidies for electric vehicles, it's not even clear you would get a 1-to-1 ratio. You know, sometimes the benefits are smaller than the cost. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. Maybe the social cost of carbon is higher than we think. There are also other benefits like particulate matter, but this is just to say that this is not only above water, it looks a lot more attractive than some options within our borders. So just to wrap up, you know, the global poor will be especially hard hit by climate change. Rich countries like the US have more resources and responsibility to mitigate climate change, but developing countries are an important part of the way to mitigate climate change because some of the most cost-effective options are in poorer countries, and it's an opportunity to have a win-win for global development and conservation. So thanks very much.
Awesome, thank you, Seema. So I'm going to share my slides now. Let's see if I can find them here. Great. So I'm gonna continue the presentation of Seema with a presentation that focuses more on US and European policies, basically. So I'll talk about climate policies a bit in general in the introduction, but then I will talk more specifically about leakage concerns. Leakage is the concern that we have that if we put a lot of regulation about emissions in the US or in the European Union, we will not really solve the problem. We will just shift them to other places of the world. And as you can imagine, in the context of climate change, it's a big concern. So I'll talk about that. But before, I wanted to give a bit of an overview. So I think today we have, I'm not sure they are great. I want to see them happen, but we at least have very positive news coming from our world leaders. As you might know, climate change is expected to lead to dramatic consequences, and it's already having a big impact on food and water security in developing countries, as Seema was mentioning, but also it's having a lot of events here, impacts here in the US, with wildfire seasons being extended, the severity of wildfires increasing. Cold or hot, it gets more extreme, as we saw in Texas. So we are already experiencing climate change, and there is a sense that we need to urgently start thinking about it more seriously, because we are nowhere in the neighborhood of being on track. So again, this has been, I think there's been really quite a wake-up call in recent years, in part thanks to all the youth movement that we have seen. And more we see climate policy being taken seriously and being part of a more integral, being a more integral aspect of what governments do and think about. As an example, the ECB, the European Central Bank, has announced that they will include climate change risks in their assessment of the economy, something that they were not doing until now. So it's really quite a change of a scene. People, when we think about the climate change problem, we should think about it as a bucket. There's a bucket that we have already filled quite a lot, and we basically want to stop filling it. And the filling of the bucket is emissions. So if we asked scientists in 2000, they told us we should start reducing emissions. And what did we do? We kept increasing them. In 2005, scientists told us we should start reducing emissions. And we didn't do it, so we kept going. So this is what scientists told us we should do in 2005. And you know, it looks kind of smooth, but declining. Then in 2010, it looked smooth, but declining kind of faster. And we're getting at the point in which scientists are telling us, okay, you gotta do something now, like for real. And I don't know, it sounds like maybe we're hearing it out, I don't know. But as you can see, it does get harder and harder to solve the problem. This is an example where we're trying to keep the temperature on average from rising 2 degrees. But again, the extremes are high and some places were hit much more than that. So it's really not a comfy scenario we're talking about, but one that maybe if governments put the thread in the needle might be within reach. So this is what the scientists tell us. And again, finally, politicians are sitting down and thinking, okay, maybe we want this to happen. Again, subject to concerns, I'll discuss later. So there are many challenges in making this happen. And if we think about it in kind of economic terms, and here I'm not trying to be exhaustive, we have what we call a free rider problem, that if you emit, it affects everyone, but you're kind of waiting for others to do something that's kind of also related to the tragedy of the commons. There's also the tragedy of the horizons, that we keep putting off action, kind of making it our children's problem, our grandchildren's problem. And there's also the problem of leakage, which I will explain later. These are economic problems. Politically, there's also a question of whether it's even feasible, even if people kind of know we have to do this. And there's also a problem of long-term credibility. So I am thrilled that Biden is excited about solving the climate change problem, but the political cycle is not that long. So we kind of want to make sure that there is long-term credibility. And until now, I would say there's been a massive lack of prioritization. And again, it's kind of welcome news that since January, this is being put at the forefront of the US agenda. So there are severe market failures that make this hard. So in economic terms, there are externalities. So if we emit, we hurt everyone else. There are unobservable actions. It's easy to emit CO2 and other people not finding out. And one example is what Seema was mentioning of deforestation, how we track that. Satellite imaging sounds promising to make it a bit more observable. Innovation is also in some way a market friction, because as you might know, appropriating the gains from innovation is often difficult, and there are many reasons to, for example, implement R&D subsidies or other policies that might help remediate these type of market failures. There's also a potential failure for coordination. So there's a good equilibrium in which all of these countries make these announcements and stick to them, but there's also an equilibrium where everyone starts tracking each other. So it's kind of important to think about that. Finally, and given that we've been sitting on our chair for such a long time without doing much, the pace of the policy needs to be fast. And for that, the policy needs to be acceptable for at least the median voter, for at least a good share of the population. So a successful policy agenda would need to check many buckets or many boxes. It would need to be feasible and kind of now. It would need to be credible, but not just today, over a long horizon. It would have to be effective. And by that, I mean that whatever we come up with, we have to be able to verify that the reductions in greenhouse gases are actually happening. We also need to acknowledge that some solutions, like stopping combusting fossil fuels, are much more certain than other solutions, like sequestering gases. And finally, as economists, we like to say we would love it to be efficient, which is from all the things that would check the boxes 1, 2, and 3, we want the one that would cost less, at least from an ex-ante perspective. We sit down and we think, okay, from all the policies that satisfy 1, 2, 3, what would be the least cost one? So this sounds fantastic, but honestly, at this point, it's really not possible to get there, we would keep thinking about what's the best way to do it, and we would not agree. So we are kind of past the point where we can find the perfect policy, and we're more at the point in which we are scrambling. And again, in the context of a coordination problem in which no one has been doing much, there are pros and cons to it. The pro is that at least we will see some policy being enacted. The cons, obviously, is that it would have been much better if we had implemented them a few years back. So as of now, again, the political consensus is rapidly changing, and we see some appetite for imperfect, but kind of moving us in a more positive direction. So today we kicked off the day, as Claire explained, with some big announcements. Many economies have been announcing already last year and now this year cuts in their emissions. In part, this has been eased by the fact that technology has been improving a lot. So unilaterally, it used to be the case that it was very unattractive for a country to push decarbonization strategies, but more and more being carbon neutral is cheaper and cheaper, thanks to renewables, batteries, and possibly, although today not yet cheap, hydrogen. So we are seeing all these costs being cut, and that today kind of more cheerful environment should not be separate from that fact. It's thanks to all these R&D efforts that we now have a more positive environment when it comes to climate policy coordination. It's also true that more and more people have been aware of climate change, and particularly in the US. So in Europe, the population was already convinced that climate change is happening and it's human-made. But in the US, the typical voter was still kind of not quite on board. Maybe not 50% of voters, but still a very large share of voters were not very much on board, and this has changed also quite a bit. So these are some positive trends. So what are the likely roadblocks to fulfilling all these big announcements? So the one I'll talk about is leakage, and is this idea that not all countries might be on board, and we might be basically shifting emissions some other place. There's also the danger that there are emissions even within the US or Europe that are not being properly counted. And here we might think of rarer emissions, for example, from highly potent greenhouse gases. These are things that go into our fridges, refrigerants. These are a big threat, and it might be that we aren't counting how much of it is leaking even within our countries. The other challenge is that the US or Europe make all of these commitments, but in some sense keep investing in dirty technologies outside. So one concern of mine is that we push development in, for example, the continent of Africa through foreign direct investment, for example, in the form of foreign aid that is encouraging the use of fossil fuels. So all these things should be avoided. And actually South Korea, for example, today announced that they will stop in encouraging by FDI the use of coal in other countries. We don't need to just do coal, we need to do coal and natural gas. Finally, there's also the risk of miscounting how net zero we are. And here I put it in terms of creative accounting. So it's very tempting to say that some technologies are net zero. It makes it much easier politically to hit our targets. An example is biomass. Typically, it gets very favorable accounting, but biomass can still lead to a lot of deforestation, as Seema was explaining, so it's a bit dangerous. Another is carbon capture and sequestration. How sure are we that it's working, and to which extent? It will need proper monitoring. Another one actually is unreliable offsets. So in its first run, the European carbon market had offsets that were very lenient, and they were misused quite dramatically. So they were being used to claim that Europe was reducing emissions. In reality, they were funding offsets in developing countries that were really, they were shown to be not very effective. So we really need to put a lot of monitoring and kind of make sure that that we do not have these creative accounting schemes, because again, otherwise the bucket keeps filling. Finally, there could be some shocks that are unexpected that could make this difficult. One is that technology progress stalls, although I don't think this is likely. We will keep putting money in making improvements. The other thing that could happen is that we discover that getting the last emissions out gets more and more difficult. This could be, for example, because the cost of materials keep getting higher, for example, for renewables, or we run out of where to put it. We need to really expand the grid, for example. So these are some potential roadblocks. I'm sure you could come up with more, but I just wanted to highlight some. So I will now talk more directly about leakage and briefly mention a project of mine. I will not explain my project as well as Seema did, so I will only briefly touch on my research project. So leakage is the problem that I was mentioning, that we basically reduce our emissions here, but they go somewhere else, sometimes also taking economic activity away. So they are really not something that policymakers or stakeholders like. They really are not a very good outcome. So in some ways, we can think about these as fiscal paradises, a fiscal paradise where it's kind of evasion. You move emissions outside, you're kind of evading your responsibility regarding the emissions. This has happened with many environmental regulations. It doesn't need to be for climate change, but the problem with climate change is that no matter where these emissions happen, the bucket again keeps filling. So the problem of leakage has been often used as an excuse to not take action. So it's kind of what people say, oh, it's not that I don't want to take unilateral action, but if no one else is doing it, it will be useless. So why should I even do it? That's kind of a typical argument. For example, the European Union and California, which have the most ambitious carbon pricing programs in the world as of today, or maybe among the most ambitious, they ended up kind of watering down their carbon price for the most affected industries. Nowadays, the EU is discussing a mechanism to tax emissions that come into the European Union to mitigate a little bit the leakage problem, but countries are fighting this hard with the excuse that it's very hard to get it right. So it's kind of a type of argument that makes it easy, because in truth, it's a big concern. It makes it easy not to take action. So this is an example of my own research. I worked with the California Resources Board to revise their approach to leakage in their cap and trade program. It's, if some of you are living in California, it's what's called AB32. So this program, it started in 2013 and covers emissions in the state of California in most manufacturing sectors, electricity and refining. So it's, in terms of coverage, maybe the most ambitious program in the world. So the challenge is that California is not even a sovereign country, it's a state. So it has very limited ways in which it can tax imported emissions, which is the solution that the European Union is now looking into. So producers and policymakers were very concerned about the potential for leakage. So in 2013, when they thought about this problem, what they did is implement output-based rebates. And it's very similar to what was put in place in the European Union. So in some ways, it mirrored that policy in the European Union. So Seema had carrots. I'll have carrots and sticks. That's how output-based rebates work. So basically, the stick is that firms, manufacturing firms, still have to pay for the emissions that they emit at the price of carbon. They have to pay the tax as anyone else. But the carrot is basically that they will receive part of that cost back as a function of their output. So if I'm a cement producer and I produce 1,000 tons of cement, I pay for the emissions that came with those 1,000 tons of cement, but I will get part of those emissions back. The way I get them back is based on an industry benchmark. So if I'm kind of an average firm or a benchmark firm in the market, I receive back all the permits that I had to pay for. If I'm dirtier, I have an incentive to become a bit cleaner. And if I'm even cleaner than the benchmark, I might even make a little bit of money from this program. So the idea is that this carrot will incentivize the cleaner firms to produce, and it will also incentivize the dirtier firms to basically invest in becoming cleaner. So that's the story, and it sounds very good. In practice, what happens is that the rebates are useful. Again, they set a good carrot and also keep the stick. But in practice, these have been very high. So California basically classified their industries depending on how trade exposed they are or how emissions intensive they are. And if you were very emissions intensive or very trade exposed, cement, for example, then you would get into the high leakage risk category: steel, glass, paper. So all these very highly polluting industries and energy intensive industries. So for these high leakage risk industries, they basically almost received everything back. So it made the price of paper, the price of cement, or the price of glass really not go up, because the tax that they ended up paying, the effective carbon price, was very, very low. On top of that, and given the prices, carbon prices in California, the carrot was really not big enough to make the firms invest in cleaner technologies. So you have a carbon price in place, the effective carbon price is much lower, and people are not really able to justify becoming cleaner. So it's kind of a watering down of the policy, and this has also happened in the European Union. Obviously, this is a bit disappointing, but both for California and the European Union, back in the day when there was less consensus on what we need to do, it's the only thing that was politically feasible. So with my co-author, Meredith Foley, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, we studied the presence of these rebates, these subsidies. And basically, we started from a theoretical point of view, like a theory model of ECON 101. Can they be justified from a theoretical point of view? And a more normative question: what should be the right level for these subsidies? And our model tells you that the answer depends on the elasticity of foreign emissions. So if we manage to reduce a ton of CO2 in a given industry, how much will leak outside? 0.5, 0.75, and depending on the number, you should give a higher rebate or a lower rebate. So this is very intuitive, but also very difficult to measure. So with my co-author, we tried to get a lot of data to come up with a formula and compute empirically what the right rebate should be in the context of the AB 32 policy. So this was very difficult. And we did do the efforts to compute these rebates. They were far from perfect. Even so, CARB used our results to make new proposals for their 2020 revision of the program, which was very exciting. So in our study, we basically suggested with our study that the rates are important and they are justified from an economics point of view, but as implemented, they are too large. That was not great, because we were trying to cut their subsidies, their rebates, in half, and that did not get a lot of support. So what happened is that it went into public hearings, and very quickly the proposal got kind of killed. In part, it's precisely because this is a very hard question to answer. So even though we did our best with our data, our answers were still not kind of bulletproof. And especially industry by industry, it was very hard to be precise on what the right rebate, the right subsidy should be for each industry in a way, again, that would be kind of bulletproof. When we think about manufacturing, we cannot use the randomized control trial that Seema was talking about. So it gets much, much harder to have something that's airtight. So one thing I learned from this process is that when doing research versus doing policy, it gets quite different. And actually, I think when doing policy, we do need simpler policies, even if they are not perfect. Going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, a simpler proposal might have been less subject to criticism, and maybe it would have had a better shot in the public hearings. As it happened, it really didn't help much, and it actually ended up kind of backfiring a little bit. And in 2020, the rebates were still quite high. So this is kind of sharing a little bit my experience. I didn't have anything else, but I'll be happy to answer in the Q&A.
Okay, starting off with the Q&A. This first one is kind of a little bit more targeted at Professor Jayachandran. It's kind of a combination of a few questions we've got throughout, but people are interested in knowing how would you incentivize developed countries to kind of work with developing countries? Like, would there be some kind of credit system for them, or are there charities who are going in this direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, this is one of the changes that happened in the Paris Agreement. The targets are voluntary, so who knows if that's going to be what's guiding what the U.S. is doing or another rich country. But there's something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which kind of introduces this idea that rich countries can meet their emissions targets by getting credit for something they fund in a lower income country. And then with the Paris Agreement, so for a while, deforestation was left out of that, partly because it's just more challenging to measure that you protected the forest than installed these solar panels or something like that. But one of the changes of Paris Agreement was exactly this, to allow countries to get credit for their emission targets. And so this is already built into the international schemes. And so it's on the table for the US. Our goal is to meet Paris Agreement targets to fund this. In terms of individuals, so, in some ways, offsets you buy if you take a plane ride or something, some of them there are different projects that are behind those carbon credits or offsets, but some of them are projects in low-income countries. I think a challenge in that market of offsets is that people want some verification that you actually had the impact on carbon. So in our study we do fancy satellite imagery and we did a randomized control trial. That's not feasible or realistic for all of these projects, but you need some sort of monitoring to show that this isn't just cheap talk, that you protected the forest. And so I think there's an opening, and some foundations are trying to fund this, or some corporations, to try to build up the market so that there are tools so that, a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Mexico can verify that they're actually protecting the forest. And then, us, whether we're feeling guilty about a plane ride or just want to have philanthropy, can start to fund those projects more easily.
Mar, do you have anything that you want to add to that, or should I move on? Okay. Next kind of general topic that I'm seeing, people are interested in knowing what do you guys envision will be kind of the pathway of the usage of fossil fuels, both in the short term and in the long term, and how people working in oil companies, how they can make kind of these transitions?
Maybe I can take a stab. I think it's a very difficult question, especially for countries that have oil and gas resources. So I expect that countries that do not have a lot of oil and gas resources, given how renewables are evolving and other technologies, I am hoping that those countries will be less and less likely to exploit the resources. But for fossil fuel rich countries that might be poorer, it will be harder to move away from these fuels. There's also the companies. The companies obviously are extremely large companies that have been in this business model for a long time, and they will be up for some big hits. I think there will be the temptation to classify some imperfect carbon capture sequestration as net zero, and this is something that obviously companies will be trying to get approved, because otherwise, to me, the vision is that we should stop using fossil fuels, period. I don't think this will happen. I think we will count some things as carbon capture sequestration, but I also think those will not be perfect. But this is more in the US and Europe how I think it might go. In developing countries, the ones that are not using the technologies yet, or they are using them in not a lot of intensity, I actually am hoping that they can just leapfrog the whole thing. But I think we will be seeing a push to again, as foreign aid, as foreign direct investment, we'll see a push to basically, like we did with tobacco or sugar, to bring it there. And those are things to look out for.
Another question would be, what do you guys think are going to be the economic impacts of a lot of these climate change policies, like things having to do with employment or stock prices for companies?
Stock prices for companies, I was actually very curious. I wanted to do it before this meeting, how the stock prices for fossil fuel companies have reacted to this morning announcements, but I haven't been able to check. I don't know if anyone has and wants to share it in the chat. So let's see, for the cost of the recovery, there's a lot of discrepancy among economists and social scientists and scientists. Some believe it will be this magic thing that will create employment, cost nothing, and bring us to, I don't know, the next galaxy. I am honestly thinking that it will have some costs. I believe in terms of employment, it is an opportunity because keeping forests in shape, avoiding massive wildfires, deploying huge infrastructure projects, that will for sure generate employment, but it sure will cost money. So I really cannot give you a percentage, and it's something that is highly uncertain, I would say. But at this point, and given the technology, it will be less expensive than even what we thought 5 years ago. So that's a bit on the positive. But yeah, I'm not on board with the people who think that it will be complete growth. I don't think that might happen.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, it's tempting, or I understand the politics of saying this is going to be, a net economic boon for the US or for poor countries. And, but I guess the hard politics of that is that's not true, but, it's important to do. It's important to do so that there's a functioning Earth for future generations. And, there's even an economic way to think about it, which is, yes, it's costing us money, but the alternative is costing us even more money. It might not be as tangible. We're not seeing it in our government budget, but lower GDP growth or mortality and healthcare costs. And so, I guess I hope we evolve to that being a convincing political argument to, voters that that's why it's worth spending money on climate change policy.
So I'm sorry for everyone who submitted these. We've gotten lots of questions and good questions, but we only have time for about one more. So I was going to ask, given kind of our political landscape and the fact that, as economists, we've been throwing out carbon taxes and other mechanisms, and it hasn't necessarily been received well. What do you think is the role of economists moving forward, and how can we better communicate with the general public our ideas?
I'll let you go first, Mar.
Go for it. I was trying to answer some questions in the chat and got distracted. So because there are so many, I was trying to answer people. So Seema, if you can go first, you will make me a favor.
I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think there's just a general point that economists, if just evidence-based policy, I don't know what the alternative is to evidence-based policy, but that seems to be rare enough that it has its own terminology, and it's hard to make an argument why you shouldn't be thinking about evidence and theoretical arguments and thinking through unintended consequences. This is the bread and butter of economists and other social scientists, and so I think just trying to I guess there's this extra step when you have academic research of trying to engage with policymakers or communicate your results to a broader audience. I just think it's really important so that what we know as researchers starts to actually trickle through to policy.
Yeah, I actually think communication should go both ways. We really have to have a more direct channel, because I think our research can be better if we communicate more often with policymakers. Sometimes I work with these manufacturing policies. It's really difficult to get them in place. So sometimes as academics, we think a lot about it and we tell them what we think, and they tell us, oh my God, this is not even remotely possible. So I think having a more kind of both ways conversation can be important too, like communicate with them what we find, but also kind of listen to what they need from us. I've been doing this more and more. And it's been a bit, appalling, all the constraints that are in place when you try to do climate policy, but in some ways it can also help make my research more relevant when it comes to informing policy. So when I go and share my new findings, I know they are a bit more tailored to what might be possible in this scene.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for your presentations. They were fantastic.
Yes, thank you both so much. I hope everyone will join me for a virtual applause from wherever you are. Thank you both so much. I know I learned a lot. Thank you again so much for joining us for this talk. I hope that you all enjoyed it. The recording will be sent out hopefully early next week, so be on the lookout for that. And have a great Earth Day and a great rest of your week. Bye, everyone.